those who have come after in terms of our leadership have been able to maintain a presence is that black people have always had a certain amount of moral currency that we have been using. And let me be the first to tell you, that's used up.
A major problem with the Boondocks' 2005 run, to me, is how much of it is drenched in respectability politics. For those who don't know, respectability politics is essentially the idea that a person or a group of individuals aren't deserving of respect unless they behave in a certain way that is respectable to our society. Framing this around black people in the Boondocks, it makes this subject more difficult to talk about. The Boondocks does a lot to position and frame a clear difference between black people and, well, there's a fundamental difference between black people and we need to make that distinction clear so black people know how to not behave, how not to act, right? This thinking isn't for our benefit, it's for white people's. So we can appear respectable to white people and they'll treat us as such. It gets to the point where in season 4, Huey walks up to Granddad and effectively says, think about what a white person would do. And yeah, like season 4 isn't that great, but this point is also echoed in season 1. I make this point to say I actually think this is one of the fundamental flaws with the Boondocks in retrospect, not in just its conflicted usage of the N-word, but how it positions the problems black people face to its audience.
For that paper, look how low we are stoop. Even if you in a bench, you still up in a cool, yeah, come on. And when it falls down, who you gonna call now? Come on. And when it all falls down.
This video is sponsored by Skillshare. This video has a lot of complicated edits, and something I try to make sure of is that I'm making something visually interesting enough for people. Thankfully, Skillshare has the largest online learning community for creatives. I've been working on my video game for over 2 years now, and trying to manage that, a job, a marriage, and everything else is very difficult. Oftentimes, I find myself just aimlessly scrolling YouTube for tutorials on very specific things, or it can be a massive time sink, I'm not gonna lie. Thankfully, Skillshare's courses are time efficient and allow me to develop my skills as an editor, designer, and game designer. There are thousands of classes from game design, UI, graphic, if you can think of it, Skillshare probably has it. I've been getting back into illustration recently, and I shared some of my old work on Blue Sky. Something that actually helped me improve were courses I took on gestures. I made a whole YouTube short about the different Boondocks art styles, but now I can actually practice the different art styles. My favorite is Carl Jones and David Coleman. From film to animation, Skillshare covers a lot of ground. And because the platform is taught from the perspective of fellow creatives, there's a mutual understanding of the process and the steps taken to get into any given field or skill. And guess what? The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today, do your thing.
As soon as I got there, they went, there he goes. He goes, who? And he goes, there's the rich. I was like, oh, he said, and everybody's looking at me like, so? And I was like, oh my God, this is where I'm gonna be staying? He just said,
well, you got in one of your records.
Guz. He's
Different.
talking about Gurs. Gurs was the ones on the rope hanging out the thing. Guz is the ones with gold ropes hanging out at clubs.
A lot of this conversation genuinely ties back into the usage of the N-word. To understand the origin of some of this, we need to understand how the N-word has been reclaimed in pop culture. You might wonder how this ties into the Boondocks and respectability politics, but it surprisingly does, believe it or not. The unspoken rules regarding the N-word and how it's used really depend on who's using it. Tupac made a clear distinction between and like, he said the difference was that an was gosh, even saying the hard R is hard. He said the difference was that was someone that had a rope around him and was someone that had a chain around him. Look, Tupac is cool, man, but some people deify Tupac way too much, man. Way too much, man. Chris Rock, who kind of repopularized this conversation back in the 2000s, made his perspective really clear.
There's like a civil war going on with black people, and there's two sides. Black people,
and this kind of paved the way for how a lot of black comedians in the media would paint this conversation. There were normal black people, and that ruined everything for everyone. This skit was wildly successful and led to the Chris Rock Show, and eventually led to the Dave Chappelle Show, which normalized the usage of the N-word. And finally, the Boondocks, which many people at the time felt was a successor to the Chappelle Show. And this show and its creators weren't shy about this fact. This framing is what the Boondocks uses when using the N-word throughout the show. It's ultimately what leads to the creation of Colonel H. Stickmeaner. When you look at interviews by Aaron, he makes two things very clear. One, he's not afraid to air out black people's dirty laundry.
Well, actually, we had him.
And second, he thinks the controversy surrounding the animated show using the N-word is silly and childish, with one of his justifications being how many comedians before him, like Richard Pryor and Paul Mooney, popularized the usage ages ago, to the point where, to him, it feels dishonest to try and depict black people, in the media or otherwise, and not use the N-word. Even outside the influence of hip-hop and how it was used there, I want to use this to frame the context of how the word was used within the show. Because it wasn't in the strip until the end. It wasn't in the pilot, and even if it was, the extent and nature to which it's used is very tied to the culture at the time. And Aaron admits this. I hear a lot of people talk about Aaron's vision for the Boondocks and what it originally was, but the truth is, it's always changing relative to his life experience. Let me give you an example.
I'm just a team player while every man for self. You stand for nothing, probably can't stand yourself. Fuck a handout, run around demanding help. Used to be the help, now I'm the man myself. I went from
The Boondocks was conceptually about and inspired by Aaron's childhood. Frustrations with his school, Jasmine's struggle with her hair, his self-identification, and assimilating into a white neighborhood, it's all derivative of Aaron's experiences growing up. There's a bunch of citations to prove this. But when you watch the 2005 show, that's not what the show explores. Its introduction to the concept is a massive garden party, where Huey is having a dream about giving a speech that makes white people lose it. According to Aaron, this was inspired by his experience giving talks for the comic strip, both in how some white people reacted to the strip, but also in how they didn't react and simply clapped, tying back to this idea that Huey and Riley are just so adorable that nobody is processing what they're actually saying.
Right. Well, the central character's name is Huey Freeman. He's a little bit to the left of Castro. He's a radical socialist, conspiracy theorist type.
And it looks like he's about 11. I can't tell what age.
He's probably younger than that. I actually don't ever officially give them an age, but yeah, he's around that.
But for a visual cue, and he's this cute kid with a great big kind of afro,
big spiky afro,
but and cute, but always a look on his face like he's got he's angry with the weight of the world on his shoulders.
I sell angry black politics to 20 million white people a day. How do I do it? Because they're cute. That's it. That's the long and the short of it. If I drew characters that actually look like Huey P. Newton and Louis Farrakhan, I would be drawing this strip in my basement. Nobody would have ever seen it.
If you're paying attention, these are two radically different ways of exploring this topic, but the time period in which they're created affected how Aaron chose to introduce us to these characters. One is derivative of his childhood, and the other is more derivative of his time in Hollywood as a celebrity. This is a clear example of how time and culture can impact a piece and how it's produced. But more on that in a different video. The cultural landscape played a massive role in not only how Aaron used the word within the show, but ultimately how he frames black issues. One of my biggest frustrations with the Boondocks sometimes is Ruckus. He's obviously supposed to be a parody of self-hating black people, but also kind of in theme of the video, respectability politics. Surely then the issue is him. But Ruckus is presented as an extreme, and one of my frustrations with a lot of people is that we spend so long fixating on the extremes that we don't question what is normalized. I want to provide a better example of how the Boondocks frames interracial issues, where Aaron is critiquing an element of black culture that he finds self-destructive and how he approaches it. The itis. Granddad sincerely loves cooking. He gets complimented for it all the time. It's not framed as something that we should immediately look down on, neither the opportunity he has to have his own restaurant. Huey may have his reservations and Ed Wuncler is a jackass, but ultimately there's nothing inherently wrong with this. The itis instead chooses to focus on a cultural critique of tradition. In response to Huey's critiques of the culture, Grandad argues that this is their culture. This is what they've always done. So it questions whether or not what we always do, what we did to find strength and solitude, is actually the most conducive thing for us. And for the most part, it's handled with a lot of sincerity, while making the perspective very clear. You sympathize with Grandad for finally having something to call his own, while also seeing the negative effects it has on the area. Let's compare this to, say, the S word. Despite this being an episode about Riley being called the N-word by his teacher, a premise that's really interesting and exciting to think about, it's treated with very little care and sincerity. The show tells us that we shouldn't care or sympathize with Riley and Grandad because it's not a big deal, and they're just being performative. Regardless of whether this was done solely to spite Al Sharpton or because they thought it'd be funnier, I don't really care. It makes the episode feel really insincere because there are black people that care. It's so weird to have Huey, the most radical black character in the show, not care about this. In the comics, Huey would have flipped the lid over this, right? But here he is effectively telling Grandad to get over it.
The problem with restraining speech is who gets to set the rules. If it's only okay in a certain time or place, who gets to say what time and what place? Bill Cosby?
Yes.
What is he talking about? What is he talking about? What is bro talking? Which makes it an episode that's really easy to weaponize against black people. And I've seen it. I've seen people echo this teacher's exact speech time after time after time. The episode wants to make a point about how we shouldn't hustle controversy for profit, but it mixes it with an episode about the N-word. It makes a point about how arguing about the usage of the N-word is pointless, because at the time, that was one of the biggest critiques of the show. But if you want to make a point about free speech and censorship, then do that. If you want to make a point about hustling controversy, then do that. But why present black people as insincere when they air their frustrations about it? I don't, and this is real. This is very real. This is just me talking. Now, it's no script, just me. I'm gonna speak with some real authority on this one. I don't really care what anyone has to say about it. Despite what the media, the white media, what algorithms manufactured for white entertainment and profit might tell you, not every black person likes to hear the N-word. Not every black person likes to say it. And even if both of those things were true, nobody is being performative when they say they don't want to hear it. I don't mind it, but I'm not so close-minded that I think everybody does. And you have to either A, have a very limited perspective to not believe that, or B, and I'm being so real, you don't know that many black people, and you probably get a lot of your ideas of blackness from the media. The best part of the S-word is the moment where Grandad tries to convince Huey that the N-word has been reclaimed and now just takes on a new meaning. And he just looks at him because he knows he's lying. I think if the episode focused more on the nuances of how the N-word has been reclaimed, then it'd be a lot more effective. But any message it's trying to have is diluted in this weird message of free speech. It's not that Huey doesn't have a point, it's that the context is a white suburban teacher using the N-word to a black student in a white neighborhood. Like, dude, am I the crazy one? And like, I don't care. And this goes back to this point. Oh, it's based on a real issue. So? What relevance does that have? To be very blunt, what relevance? Because really, it's based on a real issue, but the whole episode isn't just that microcosm of what it's parodying, you know? This isn't an isolated incident. The MLK episode, which is really strong, bookends with MLK calling black people ignorant, making a whole point to differentiate black people from, and it's very clearly derogatory. It's important to keep this in mind because once again, there's a separation of black people and And one of the things I'm really thankful for the Boondocks for is that it's really raw in how it depicts and views the culture. So it's very transparent in what it says. It's beat for beat what Chris Rock says. Don't be a be better. It's a misguided attempt to reach people. It has MLK concede that there are black people that are and they're lazy and they complain and they judge others and they're late and they're ignorant. But by whose standards? A word used to put down black people is now culturally at a point where it's used to separate the respectable black people, the good blacks, and those that aren't. And if you're going to argue that's not what it's saying, what other message can you impart in what he's saying? It's a lovely episode, right? Post 9/11 America, it's great. But it's bookended so poorly, and the only people that are going to celebrate this are people predisposed to thinking negatively of black people. In the Stink Mean episodes, we reach a point where, like, yeah, you know, the fights are really good, but the third one ends with a line saying, yeah, man, some niggas just gotta go jail. What? Huey, the prison abolitionist? Like, what? You got nothing to say to that? You don't have anything to add? The same boy that felt bad for wishing jail on Diddy? If you're catching on too, Huey's presence makes these things more egregious because he's a black leftist. Like, some of these things don't even align with what your character is about. At its best, these episodes explore how bruised pride and ego make you lose yourself to petty moments. That one's masculinity is more than the ability to fight, but to walk away. But at their worst, they're telling black people to stop being ignorant and act more like caricatures of white people. Because if they don't, they're going to go to jail. So stay in line. And there's a way to frame parts of that message, keyword there being part, without making it into respectability politics. And I guess the part that's most annoying is the Boondocks was rewarded for this. It got a Peabody for this, and the network executives told them which episodes were best and they needed more of. The first episode they worked on for season 2 was Stink Meaner 2. I used to always ask myself, why do conservative white people love this show so much? And it finally dawned on me, it's not because the Boondocks is critical of black people. It's because it frames its issues with black people very often through the lens of respectability. And that lens, sadly, is for the eyes of white people. I've spent quite a bit of time critiquing the Boondocks' approach. Some of this is relative to the time periods and some of it isn't. This is why it's important to be critical of everything you consume. I know there's a bunch of propaganda campaigns that Aaron is this unsung genius, and that's very explicitly the intention. But even the Boondocks fell victim to some of the trappings of the time period. It's not an infallible work, but that doesn't mean the show is washed. The fact that we can talk about it in this way, the way that we are now, is part of why I'm so enamored with it. If the point of satire is truly to spark a conversation, then I'd say the Boondocks is serving its purpose. Because regardless of whether you agree or disagree with me, there's a conversation to be had there. I also don't want to prescribe all of this onto Aaron's perspective because some of this was out of his control, and it's difficult to keep a show on TV. I love the pilot, but I do agree with Aaron. If the pilot was picked up, it wouldn't have lasted more than 2 seasons. Not in that ecosystem, not in that time period. Boondocks thrived for many years, but one of the reasons was that it was seen as a successor to what came before it. To close out this video, I want to read something from Aaron that he wrote in Charlamagne's book. And I want to stress, I wouldn't own this book if someone didn't tell me Aaron wrote in it. I'm not a fan of Charlamagne, man. I really want to make that clear. All in all, I think the solution to some of these problems is that we need to stop spending so much time worrying about how white people feel. Everything in this country is centered around how it makes white people feel. Like, if it's going to offend white people, they can't do it. And that's the animating principle. That's white supremacy. Aaron's perspective on this has remained fairly consistent throughout the years, even if the show doesn't always correlate with this stance. Let me make myself clear. There's nothing wrong with critiquing black people and popular black media and culture, because a lot of what is normalized is dictated by white executives and algorithms designed for profit. But don't be mistaken into thinking you have some form of moral currency to reclaim. If someone is racist, they're gonna be racist. You can't maneuver your way around that, and you shouldn't be expected to. It's not black people versus it's not even moments. It's just black people.